Welcome to Dreamed It, Then Real Lifed It, the podcast where we dive deep into the journey from vision to reality. I'm Kelly Jackson, your guide on this path of self-discovery, transformation, and intentional living. Here, we explore everything from mindset shifts and personal growth to spiritual alignment and entrepreneurship, sharing insights, stories, and actionable wisdom to help you live a life in harmony with your dreams. Every episode will dig into what it means to not only dream big, but to actually consciously create the life you envision. Let's turn your dreams into real life. I think one of the strangest seasons of life is being a teenager. You are old enough to want independence, but you're still young enough to need support. And you want freedom, you want autonomy, you want to make your own decisions, but often you don't yet fully understand the weight of those decisions. And I think that's why raising teenagers can feel so confusing. Because they're not children anymore and they're not yet adults either. They are living in this weird in-between. And you're right there in it with them. So I have 2 teenage daughters. That's why this feels like a relevant conversation. And it's actually part of a bigger theme I got going on this month in my podcast episodes, but that'll present itself later. So let's keep going. So every teenager wants independence, not because they're rebellious, because it is developmentally appropriate. Instead of talking about independence as a concept, we're going to talk about what it feels like, because I remember being a teenager and feeling like I was old enough to make my own decisions, but not having the authority to make them. And that's a pretty frustrating place to live. Perhaps you can recall that feeling as well. Teenagers are often experiencing adulthood emotionally before they're experiencing it practically, especially now, this day and age, 2026. So, as teens, they want freedom, they want respect, they want autonomy, they want their opinions to matter. And in many ways, they should, because they're practicing adulthood. The problem is they're practicing. It's not a problem, but you understand what I'm saying. The issue, not an issue either. Why am I searching for words here? You understand what I'm saying. So they're practicing adulthood, but that's just it. They're practicing. That's all I had to say. That's just it. They're practicing. They're not there yet. And that distinction matters, okay? Imagine if tomorrow someone handed a 16-year-old a mortgage, health insurance, taxes, payroll, a sick parent, a leaking roof. Most of them would immediately realize, oh shit, adulthood is more than freedom, okay? And that's where a lot of the tension comes from, because teenagers are looking at the freedom and parents or caregivers are looking at the responsibilities. They're looking at the same destination from opposite ends, okay? And if you're a parent of teens, or if you have ever parented teens, you know what I'm talking about. Now, this doesn't mean teens are bad, because they're not. It's just we have to understand developmentally everything that's going on. And independence is supposed to happen. The tension is healthy. They should be questioning. They should be pushing. They should be separating. That's literally part of becoming an individual. Yes? They want ownership of their time, of their decisions, of their identity, of their friendships, their appearances, their opinions. And they are trying to figure out, who am I separate from my parents or caregivers? And as parents or caregivers, this can often be misinterpreted as like resistance. Like, well, they're just resisting. This damn child resisting. But teenagers feel autonomy. Where the parents are seeing the resistance, the teens are feeling autonomy. And those aren't always the same thing. And that tension is necessary. Because if a teenager never pushes against the edges, they might struggle to develop confidence later on. So that friction is part of the process. That does not mean that it's supposed to be full out headbutting 24/7. That's not what I mean. But just a little friction, right? And I used the word problem earlier and then took it back. But in this case, I think I'm going to stick with the word problem. So the problem is that they want freedom without the consequences. Okay? This is where it gets fun. I'm not being mean. I'm being true. Okay? Everybody wants freedom. Nobody wants consequences. Adults included. And the thing is, independence and responsibility come as a package deal. And freedom and responsibility are a package deal. Adults struggle with this too, guys. This isn't just a teen problem. A lot of people want financial freedom, time freedom, relationship freedom, creative freedom. But they don't always want the discipline, the consequences, the accountability, or the sacrifice that is required. And the truth is this: freedom is not the absence of responsibility. Freedom is the result of taking responsibility, and that is a huge distinction. I know with coaching clients, I've said this so many times, and probably even just on Instagram and stuff too over the last decade. A lot of people think freedom is I get to do whatever I want, whenever I want. And in this, I'm specifically, when I referenced coaching, it's because this typically comes to time management and schedule and things like this. So there's this idea that freedom is I get to do whatever I want whenever I want. I'm free. I just get to do whatever I want whenever I want. And I don't want to be tied down by a schedule. I don't want to have to be there and do this at this time. I want to be free to do what I want when I want. Well, here's the issue with that. That's not really freedom. The freedom comes when you handle business in focused blocks of time. And you schedule things, you time block things, you work on things, you give everything a time and space, and then you're truly free, because then you don't have things lingering and hovering and in the background and floating around and arbitrarily that needs to be done, that's not really defined, that's just kind of there. When you work in focused blocks, when you schedule, when you time block, when you organize and arrange like that, when you manage your time and you take care of the things that need to be taken care of, then in your free time, you are truly free. You don't constantly have that running in the background of all these things that you need to do, because that wears on you. It affects your nervous system. It affects your mental state. It affects your capacity. It affects everything. So again, freedom isn't the absence of responsibility. Freedom is the result of taking responsibility. That's a huge distinction that somebody needs to hear today. Perhaps it was you. One thing that I notice with teenagers is that consequences often feel unfair. and I'm not only speaking of my own teenagers, this is from just being around teens. And of course, I do have my own, but also I'm not only speaking about my experiences with my 2 daughters, okay? So I've noticed that with teens that consequences often feel unfair. And that's not because they're bad kids. It's because they haven't lived long enough yet to see how cause and effect compound over time. Adults know one missed payment becomes a credit problem. One bad habit becomes a health issue. One ignored conversation becomes a relationship problem. Teenagers see the moment. Adults can see the trajectory of where it's headed. Yes? So, circling back around, independence isn't doing whatever you want. That's actually impulsivity. That's being impulsive. True independence means I'm going to make decisions, I'm going to accept outcomes, and I'm going to learn from my mistakes. The bill always arrives. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. Every decision has a cost. Every decision has a consequence. Every decision has an opportunity cost. And parents, caregivers, adults usually understand delayed consequences because they've lived long enough to have experienced it firsthand. Teenagers, they often don't, because the prefrontal cortex is still developing all the way up until you're 25 years old. So they're often evaluating, how does this feel right now? And parents are evaluating what happens 6 months from now. And that's why conflict happens. It's not usually about the event specifically. It's about the timeline. One person sees today, one person sees next year. And that can create a little friction. I'm going to call this the parenting paradox, which can be the hardest part of parenting teens, because it's kind of weird to watch someone become themselves. Not who you imagined, not who you planned, not who you would have chosen. Themselves. So when they're little, your job is protection. And then when they're teenagers, your job slowly starts becoming preparation. So like preteen and then into teenagers, then it becomes preparation. You're preparing for a life that doesn't include you making every decision. And that can be uncomfortable. And it can also be really exciting and really fun because you get to trust that all those years you poured into them, that you did prepare them, and that you can trust that they are ready, able, and capable to move on to the next chapter. And because you spend years teaching honesty and responsibility and kindness and boundaries and values. And then there comes a point where they have to choose those things without you. And that requires trust. Not trust in them being perfect. Trust in their ability to learn. Your job is to prepare them to leave. Think about that. The entire goal of parenting is eventually to become unnecessary. I mean, that is wild. There's more to it than that, but essentially, that's what we're doing. You want them to be self-sufficient human beings. Now, here's something kind of funny. Success feels like losing control. The better job that you do parenting, the less control that you will have. You have to let them practice. You can't learn responsibility without responsibility, right? And you can't learn decision making without being called to make decisions. And you can't learn consequences without consequences. So you got to let them practice. And you got to sometimes think back and remember that you too were a teen who needed practice. Watching mistakes is painful because sometimes you know exactly how something is going to end, and you have to let them discover it anyway. And this is that little place somewhere between rescue versus support, where it's like, at what point do you help? At what point do you step back? And at what point does rescuing become interfering? And that just reminded me, there's something, and I did not come up with this on my own. I read it. Gosh, I could even remember what book I read it in. It was like a homeschooling book or something that I had read a long time ago when I was preparing for homeschooling the girls, which I did do for about 2.5 years. But it was, what it had said was to ask your kids when they came to you with something, do you want me to listen? Do you want me to give advice? Or do you want me to get involved? And so when the girls come to me with something, maybe it's with a friend or something that happened at one of the events they were at, like a whatever, or school, or just whatever it is. So they come and they tell you about it, and it's like, okay, after they tell me, do you want me to listen, or do you want me to give advice, or do you want me to get involved? Because sometimes they don't want you to try to fix it or give them an answer or give them a solution. They just want to be witnessed. So they just want you to listen to them and not try to fix it or solve it or give your opinion. And then sometimes they do want to know, what would you do? And in that case, I'm going to tell them, but not without them telling me that's what they wanted. And then sometimes I feel like, I'll step in and say something if you want me to. And they're like, no, not yet. But then sometimes they might feel like, okay, yeah, I want you to. Or sometimes the answer might be like, well, not yet. I'm going to do your advice. I'm going to go say something. And then if that doesn't work, then yes, then you can say something. That sort of thing. And this has been something we've been doing for years, not just as teens, but it came to mind, so I wanted to throw it in because you may like that as well. Now, teenagers aren't the only ones in the in-between. Let's zoom out, okay? Because that weird in-between, it's not just for teens. I'm kind of in a weird in-between right now with several things happening in my life. I've got the storefront, the podcast, the apprenticeship, the art, the next chapter. I'm not where I was, but I'm not where I'm going. I'm in between. And the liminal space, right? And I think that's true for most adults. Maybe adulthood isn't always like, okay, well, I've arrived. It can be, hey, I'm an adult and I'm still becoming, and the details change, but the experience doesn't. And at 16, you are learning, who am I without my parents? At 21, you're learning, who am I without school? And speaking of 21, who am I without school? Tune in next week because Chloe's going to be back on, my apprentice. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. And then at 35, you might be learning, who am I without this relationship? That was me. That's when I left a 15-year relationship / marriage that I had been in since I was 19. And all of a sudden, I'm 35 and single for the first time since I was a teenager. And you might be at 45 saying, who am I if I change careers? And at 65, who am I without this role I've held for decades? The questions evolve. The becoming never stops. Adults are also becoming. A lot of adults still want freedom and success and autonomy without responsibility. You know, I have to laugh because it's true. We all have growing edges, guys. Teenagers are just doing theirs visibly. Adults often hide theirs better. Often we do, not always, but often. But the becoming never ends. So at 16, you're learning one version of independence. At 25, another. At 45, another. At 65, another. The lesson actually never ends. This weird in between is what we call life. Okay, we are always in transition. We're always becoming. We're always learning. We're always letting go of one version of ourselves while we are growing into another. And what I've learned watching my own daughters is they are becoming their own people. They see some things similarly to me, and they see some things differently than me. I'm watching them form opinions. I'm watching them make choices. I'm realizing they aren't extensions of me. They're not my mini-me's. They're not. I don't know that I've ever really called them that. Maybe like when they were like 1 or 2, but they're their own people. And one of the greatest privileges of parenting is getting a front row seat to someone becoming themselves. That's what I've got. I have realized that teenagers aren't difficult because they're broken. Because they're not broken. They're difficult because they're becoming. They are standing in this space between dependence and independence. They're between childhood and adulthood, between certainty and experience. And that's a place that all of us know, because no matter how old we are, there are still parts of our lives that we are still learning. And if you're listening to this, chances are you're beyond a teenager. Or at least a teenager. So you've also been there yourself, and there are still parts where we're becoming. There are still parts, even as adults, where we're figuring it out as we go. And that's like the real lesson, guys. The weird in between isn't a phase. It's the human experience. So I have concluded that one of the reasons teenagers are so fascinating is because they're becoming in a way that is impossible to ignore. We can literally watch it happening. The questioning, the experimenting, the mistakes, the independence, the hormones, the growth. But guys, if we're being honest, most of us never actually stop doing those things. Yes, it's happening all crazily in this one little burst of time in the teenage years. I'll tell you what's a crazy place. Middle school is a crazy place. I remember, and this is why I say middle school is a crazy place. Whatever the age of middle school, 6th to 8th grade. So that would be, I was 10 when I started 6th grade. And then so as young as 10, and then some people are starting high school at like 15. So basically, you got ages of 10 to 15 in middle school. When I would take the girls to middle school and do carpool, it would just always blow my mind because there were the difference in sizes at that age. We'll just say that from 10 to 15, basically you have a mix of pre-puberty and puberty, and that's the distinction. So what happens in middle school, it's the size difference. I mean, you have ones that truly look like children, and you have ones that were like, wait, was that a kid or a teacher? And that's all happening in these 3 grades. And you can't ignore that, right? Because just it's all happening in a way that it's just so bubbled, all right, boxed and bubbled right up there in the teenage years. That's all I'm saying. So we never stop doing those things. We just get older. And the weird in between isn't something we just pass through once, is what I'm saying. I think it's where life actually happens. It's somewhere between who we were and who we're becoming. So I feel like I'm kind of the reason I feel like this episode worked, or why I wanted to talk about it now, I feel like I'm kind of living from three directions simultaneously. I'm a mother of teenagers. I'm a mentor to Chloe, my apprentice, who is about to walk in here with me. We're about to record our episode, which you can listen to next week. And I'm a woman currently reinventing parts of my own life. So I'm standing at all 3 points on the timeline at once. And, I think that's what makes this episode interesting, at least to me. It's not just about parenting. It's not just about teenagers. It's about becoming. And everyone's lived through this strange season where they wanted freedom and certainty in adulthood before they fully understood what came with it. So if there is a moody or a teen in your life that just, is being a teen, give them a little grace. Maybe it's a niece, a nephew, a neighbor, or whatever. I don't know, a student. Just remember what it was like. Maybe it's your own kid. Remember what it was like to be a teen. Okay? Remember what it was like. Give them a little grace and be a good mentor to them. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in to Dreamed It, Then Real Lifed It. I hope today's episode sparked something powerful within you. Remember, every step you take towards your vision counts, no matter how small. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please take a second to hit that subscribe button or leave a review. That would be amazing. Or share the podcast with someone who's ready to bring their dreams into reality too. And if you're looking to dive deeper, connect with me on social media at Dreamed It, Then Real Lifed It, or at BE_what you want. Or visit dreameditThenRealLifedIt.us for more resources on aligning your life, business, and dreams. Until next time, keep dreaming and keep manifesting your dreams into real life. Love you, friends.